Hello everyone, and welcome back to Panic Peak. Let me know where you are listening from in the world by leaving a comment, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you like the episode. Now, let's relax and let's begin. The university library was eerily silent as Marissa flipped through her notes. It was close to midnight, and the usual hum of students had died down, leaving her alone among the towering shelves of dusty books. The dim glow of a single desk lamp illuminated her workspace, casting long shadows across the wooden table. She had always loved the library's hushed solitude, but tonight, it felt different. Oppressive. The air seemed heavier, and an unshakable sense of being watched prickled her skin. Shaking off the unease, Marissa buried herself in her textbook, scribbling notes for her thesis. The sound of her pen scratching against paper was the only noise, until she heard it. A faint whisper. Her head snapped up, heart pounding. The sound was so soft she almost thought she'd imagined it. She scanned the room. Nothing. Just rows of books and empty chairs. Marissa tried to refocus, but the whispers returned, clearer this time. It wasn't random noise. Words slithered through the air, barely audible but unmistakable. "Marissa, why did you do it?" Her blood turned cold. She pushed her chair back and stood, searching for the source of the voice. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice trembling. Silence. She took a cautious step toward the nearest shelf. The whispering resumed, louder now, like a breeze brushing through the books. "You can't hide from the truth." Marissa's breath hitched. The voice was coming from the books themselves. She reached out hesitantly and pulled a thick, leather-bound volume from the shelf. As she opened it, the whispering grew deafening. The pages were blank at first, but as she flipped through them, words began to form, scrawled in jagged, ink-black script. "You thought no one would know. But we saw. We know everything." Panic surged through her. She dropped the book, and it landed with a heavy thud. The whispers grew louder, spreading across the library like a sinister chant. Every shelf seemed alive, the books vibrating as if they were breathing. Marissa stumbled backward, her mind racing. "This isn't real. It's just stress. Too much coffee," she muttered, trying to convince herself. But the library disagreed. Another book slid from a shelf and hit the floor. Its pages fluttered open, revealing her handwriting. It was a note she had written years ago, a confession she had destroyed. "You betrayed her. You ruined her life. Tell the truth, or we will." "No," Marissa whispered, her voice breaking. "It wasn't my fault. I didn't mean for it to happen." The chanting books seemed to laugh, their voices rising to a cacophony. A nearby lamp flickered and went out, plunging the library into near darkness. Desperate, Marissa ran for the exit. But the aisles seemed to stretch endlessly, the shelves twisting and turning in impossible ways. She was trapped. From the darkness, a single voice emerged, calm and commanding. "Confess." Tears streaming down her face, Marissa sank to her knees. "I didn't mean to. I just wanted to be top of the class. She was better than me, and I switched her notes before the exam. I didn't know she'd fail so badly, or that she'd. Her sobs choked her words, but the library's oppressive silence demanded more. "She dropped out," Marissa finally whispered. "And then, she's gone now. I'm sorry. I didn't mean for it to go that far." The whispers ceased. The silence was deafening. For a moment, Marissa thought it was over. But then the bookshelves began to creak and groan, the air growing colder. One by one, the books opened, their pages flipping violently. From the shadows, a figure emerged. It was her, the girl Marissa had wronged. Pale and hollow-eyed, she stared at Marissa with a mix of sorrow and fury. "You took everything from me," the figure hissed, her voice blending with the whispers of the books. "Now, I'll take everything from you." The lights flickered one last time and went out completely. Marissa's scream echoed through the library, and then there was silence. When the morning staff arrived, the library was as it always had been. Neat, quiet, and orderly. But Marissa was gone, her desk abandoned. The only trace of her was an open book, its pages blank except for a single line written in her handwriting. "I confess." The studio lights burned bright as Emily Sterling adjusted the microphone pinned to her blazer. The teleprompter scrolled slowly, her lines crisp and composed. Years of experience as a news anchor had prepared her for breaking stories, but tonight felt different. The air in the studio was charged, almost electric. "We're live in 5, the producer called, his voice echoing through her earpiece. Emily glanced at the clock. 10 p.m. sharp. She straightened her posture and fixed a calm expression as the countdown reached 0. The red light on the camera blinked on, and she began. "Good evening. We interrupt regular programming to bring you breaking news," Emily said, her voice steady. "Authorities have issued a citywide emergency. Residents are advised to stay indoors and lock all doors and windows." At home, her husband, Ryan, sat on their couch, remote in hand. The house was silent except for Emily's voice coming from the television. He watched her intently, as he always did during her broadcasts. But something about her delivery tonight unnerved him. Her tone was measured, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. "The situation is ongoing," Emily continued. "Reports indicate that an unidentified threat has been seen in multiple neighborhoods. Stay alert and do not engage." Ryan frowned. She hadn't mentioned anything about this before heading to the station. He reached for his phone to text her but stopped as she began to speak again. "We've received specific reports from the following area," Emily said, her voice faltering slightly. She hesitated, then looked directly into the camera. "Authorities are focusing their attention on Maplewood Avenue, particularly a house at the end of the street." Ryan's blood ran cold. That was their street. Their house. Described as a 2-story home with blue shutters and a red front door, Emily said, her voice now trembling. "Residents are advised to avoid this location." Ryan's hands shook as he muted the TV. He stared at the screen, at his wife, who was now visibly distressed. The description was unmistakable. She was talking about their home. The sudden creak of a floorboard upstairs broke his trance. Ryan's heart pounded. He hadn't heard anyone come in. He grabbed his phone and dialed Emily's number. It rang once, twice, then went to voicemail. On the muted TV, she was still speaking, her words silent but her expression pleading. The floorboards groaned again, followed by a faint shuffling sound. Ryan's breathing quickened. He grabbed the nearest object, a heavy lamp, and crept toward the stairs. Each step felt like an eternity. The house was eerily silent, save for the faint noise above him. When he reached the top, he noticed the bedroom door ajar, light spilling into the hallway. "Who's there?" he called, his voice cracking. No response. Only the low hum of the TV downstairs. He pushed the door open with the lamp, his eyes darting around the room. Nothing seemed out of place, until he saw the closet door. It was open just a crack. Ryan's pulse raced as he approached. He tightened his grip on the lamp, ready to swing. With a swift motion, he yanked the door open. The closet was empty. Relief flooded him, but it was short-lived. The TV downstairs crackled, the volume suddenly blasting. Emily's voice filled the house once more. "Ryan, get out of the house." He froze. She was looking directly into the camera, her eyes wide with terror. This wasn't part of the broadcast. Her lips quivered as she repeated, "Ryan, get out now. It's inside." The lamp slipped from his hands, crashing to the floor. Behind him, the bedroom door slammed shut. Liam Dalton's cramped apartment was filled with the smell of old paper and ink. Stacks of sheet music cluttered his desk, the remnants of a late-night composing frenzy. He was a struggling musician, desperate for inspiration, when he stumbled across it. The sheet music had been buried in a dusty box at a flea market, sandwiched between faded hymnals. It was ancient, the parchment yellowed and brittle, the ink faded but still legible. The title at the top read, "Requiem of Shadows." Something about it drew Liam in. The notes seemed almost alive, writhing on the page as if eager to be played. He paid the vendor without haggling and rushed home to try it out. As he set the sheet music on his piano, the room seemed to grow colder. The fluorescent light above him flickered, casting eerie shadows. Brushing it off, Liam placed his fingers on the keys and began to play. The melody was haunting, a blend of dissonant chords and mesmerizing arpeggios. It sent chills down his spine. He lost himself in the music, his fingers moving instinctively as if guided by an unseen force. The longer he played, the more the room seemed to darken, the shadows creeping closer. Then he heard it. A faint whisper, barely audible over the piano's resonance. Liam paused, his fingers hovering above the keys. The whisper stopped. He looked around, heart pounding, but he was alone. Shaking his head, he resumed playing. The melody grew more complex, the notes pulling him deeper into a trance. The whispering returned, louder this time, joined by a faint wailing that seemed to echo from the walls. "Who's there?" Liam called, his voice trembling. The whispers didn't respond, but the shadows did. They moved, stretching across the floor and walls, coalescing into vaguely human shapes. Liam froze, his hands leaving the keys. The figures stood motionless for a moment, then began to sway, as if entranced by the music. Their hollow eyes fixed on him, and their mouths moved in silent screams. Liam stumbled back, knocking over his chair. "This isn't real," he muttered. "I'm just tired." But the figures didn't fade. Instead, they advanced, their forms flickering like static. One reached out, its hand elongating unnaturally, its fingers curling toward him. Panicked, Liam grabbed the sheet music and tore it in half. The figures vanished instantly, the room returning to normal. He stood there, gasping for breath, clutching the torn pages. For days, Liam avoided his piano. But the melody lingered in his mind, an earworm that refused to let go. He couldn't sleep, he couldn't eat. The music demanded to be played. Eventually, he gave in. He taped the sheet music back together and sat at the piano. "Just once more," he whispered. "Then I'll stop." The whispers didn't respond, but the shadows did. They moved, stretching across the floor and walls, coalescing into vaguely human shapes. Liam froze, his hands leaving the keys. The figures stood motionless for a moment, then began to sway, as if entranced by the music. Their hollow eyes fixed on him, and their mouths moved in silent screams. Liam stumbled back, knocking over his chair. "This isn't real," he muttered. "I'm just tired." But the figures didn't fade. Instead, they advanced, their forms flickering like static. One reached out, its hand elongating unnaturally, its fingers curling toward him. Panicked, Liam grabbed the sheet music and tore it in half. The figures vanished instantly, the room returning to normal. He stood there, gasping for breath, clutching the torn pages. For days, Liam avoided his piano. But the melody lingered in his mind, an earworm that refused to let go. He couldn't sleep, he couldn't eat. The music demanded to be played. Eventually, he gave in. He taped the sheet music back together and sat at the piano. "Just once more," he whispered. "Then I'll stop." As soon as the first note sounded, the shadows returned, more numerous and defined. Their whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices screaming his name. Liam played faster, hoping to reach the end and break the spell. But the music had no end, the notes looped endlessly, trapping him in a cycle. The shadows closed in, their icy hands brushing his skin. Tears streamed down his face as he pounded the keys, desperate to finish the piece. His vision blurred, and the room seemed to twist and warp around him. When the neighbors finally called the police, it had been 3 days since anyone had seen Liam. They found him slumped over the piano, his hands still resting on the keys. The sheet music lay before him, but the notes had vanished, leaving only blank pages. No one could explain the deep, jagged scratches on the walls, or the faint whispering that seemed to linger in the apartment long after Liam was gone. The platform was eerily empty as James stepped onto the last train of the night. The cold wind bit at his face, and the faint hum of the train's engine was the only sound in the stillness. He checked his watch, 11:47 p.m. Cutting it close, but he'd made it. The doors hissed shut behind him, sealing him in. The carriage was dimly lit, with flickering fluorescent lights casting long shadows on the worn seats. Only a handful of passengers were scattered throughout, their faces obscured by shadows or buried in their scarves and coats. James chose a seat near the middle of the carriage, dropping his bag onto the floor. The train jerked forward, the rhythmic clatter of wheels on tracks lulling him into a sense of uneasy calm. He leaned his head against the window, watching the darkened cityscape blur past. Minutes passed. Then half an hour. He frowned, glancing at the route map above the door. They should have reached the next station by now. The train showed no signs of slowing. James shifted uncomfortably. The air felt heavier, thicker. He glanced around the carriage. The passengers were still there, but something was off. The man across from him, who James could have sworn was asleep, now sat upright, staring straight ahead. His hands, pale and claw-like, gripped his knees tightly. A woman further down the carriage turned her head sharply to look at James. Her eyes were too wide, the whites almost glowing in the dim light. She smiled, revealing teeth that were jagged and uneven, like broken glass. James's stomach churned. He tried to convince himself it was a trick of the light, that he was just tired. But as he scanned the carriage, he noticed more changes. The passengers were all staring at him now, their features subtly wrong, too long, too sharp, too inhuman. He stood, gripping the pole for support as the train swayed. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice shaky. "Is this train stopping soon?" No one answered. The silence was suffocating. He moved toward the door, planning to find the conductor or an emergency brake. But as he passed each row of seats, the passengers twisted their heads to follow him, their movements jerky and unnatural. One of them, a man in a tattered suit, let out a low, guttural growl. James broke into a run, his footsteps echoing through the carriage. He reached the end of the car and tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as he yanked at the handle, his breath coming in short, desperate gasps. "You can't leave," a voice whispered behind him. He spun around. The passengers were all standing now, their distorted forms looming closer. Their faces, if they could still be called that, melted and reformed, shifting like liquid shadows. Their eyes glowed faintly, and their mouths moved in unison, though no sound came out. James stumbled backward, pressing himself against the door. The train's lights flickered, plunging the carriage into darkness for a moment. When they came back on, the passengers were inches from him. "Why are you here?" one of them rasped, its voice like the scraping of metal. I just got on," James stammered. "I was going home." "There is no home," another hissed, its face splitting into a grotesque grin. "Not anymore." The train's speed increased, the walls vibrating with the force. Outside the window, there was nothing but an endless void, black and featureless. The familiar clatter of wheels on tracks was replaced by an otherworldly hum, low and resonant, like a monstrous heartbeat. Desperate, James turned and pounded on the door, screaming for help. The glass fogged with his breath, but there was no sign of the city, no sign of the world he knew. Just darkness. When he turned back, the passengers were gone. The carriage was empty, silent except for the hum. He stood there, trembling, when the train's PA system crackled to life. "End of the line," a distorted voice announced. "All passengers, please disembark." The train screeched to a halt, nearly throwing him off his feet. The doors slid open, revealing nothing but darkness outside. A cold wind rushed in, carrying with it the faint sound of whispers, beckoning him forward. James hesitated, clutching the doorframe. Behind him, the train began to hum louder, the walls trembling as if alive. He had no choice. Taking a deep breath, he stepped into the void. The doors slammed shut behind him, and the train roared off, leaving him alone in the endless dark. The neon sign outside WXLP radio station buzzed faintly, casting a ghostly glow over the empty parking lot. Inside, Mark Wilson leaned back in his chair, sipping lukewarm coffee. It was the graveyard shift, his shift, and the airwaves were his playground. "All right, night owls," Mark said into the mic, his voice smooth and practiced. "You're tuned into 104.7, the pulse of the night. Let's keep things rolling with a classic." He queued up a track and leaned back, enjoying the solitude. The phone rang. Mark frowned. The station's phone rarely rang this late, and when it did, it was usually a prank call or a lonely listener looking for someone to talk to. He hesitated, then picked up. "WXLP, you're on the air," he said. Silence. "Hello." A faint, static-laden voice came through. "Help me. I'm trapped." Mark's brow furrowed. "Trapped? Where?" "The studio," the voice whispered. Mark chuckled nervously. "Well, that's a new one. Who is this?" No answer. The line went dead. Mark shook his head and hung up. Prank calls weren't uncommon, especially from bored teenagers. He dismissed it and returned to his playlist. The music played on, filling the empty studio with its comforting rhythm. The phone rang again. Mark hesitated, his hand hovering over the receiver. He picked it up, more annoyed than curious. "WXLP, you're on the air." "I'm still here," the voice said. It sounded clearer now, almost familiar. "All right, Listen, Mark said, irritation creeping into his tone. If this is a joke, it's not funny. I've got work to do. So do I, the voice replied. But I can't. Not while I'm stuck. Stuck where? Mark demanded. Here, the voice said, softer now. In the studio. A chill ran down Mark's spine. The voice, it sounded just like his own. He laughed nervously, trying to shake off the unease. All right, you got me. Nice impression, but I'm hanging up. Don't, the voice pleaded. Please, you have to help me. The line went dead again. Mark stared at the receiver for a moment before setting it down. He stood and walked to the window, peering out at the empty parking lot. Nothing but the flickering neon sign and the dark shapes of parked cars. He rubbed his temples. Lack of sleep was probably getting to him. The music ended, and he returned to the console, queuing up the next track. He leaned into the mic that was another classic to keep you company this lonely night. Stay tuned for more. As he spoke, he caught movement in the reflection of the glass panel separating the studio from the soundproofed booth. He turned sharply, but the booth was empty. The phone rang again. Mark's heart pounded as he picked it up. What do you want? He barked. The voice was louder now, clearer. I told you. I'm trapped. You have to find me. This isn't funny, Mark snapped. Who the hell are you? The voice laughed, a hollow, chilling sound. You already know. The line went dead. Mark's breath came in short gasps. He scanned the room, his eyes darting to every shadow. The station was old, the kind of place that creaked and groaned with the wind, but tonight it felt alive, watching, waiting. Determined to prove it was all in his head, Mark stood and walked to the soundproof booth. The small space was empty, the microphone and equipment exactly as he'd left them. He turned to leave but froze. The glass panel reflected the studio, and in the reflection, he saw himself. But his reflection wasn't moving. It stared back at him, its eyes hollow and unblinking. Help me, the reflection mouthed. Mark stumbled back, tripping over a cable. When he looked up again, the reflection was gone. He scrambled to his feet and ran back to the console. The phone was ringing again, its shrill tone cutting through the silence like a knife. He didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed his coat and bolted for the door. As he reached it, the lights flickered, and the neon sign outside buzzed louder, casting the studio in an eerie red glow. The phone's ringing stopped. Mark turned the handle, but the door wouldn't budge. He pulled harder, but it felt as if something on the other side was holding it shut. Panic set in as the lights dimmed further, leaving him in near darkness. The console crackled, and his own voice came through the speakers. Good evening, night owls. You're tuned into 104.7, the pulse of the night. Tonight, we have a special guest, trapped here with us forever. Mark screamed, pounding on the door. The studio filled with laughter, his laughter, echoing from every corner. The glass panel reflected him again, but this time it smiled, its hollow eyes gleaming in the dim light. The phone rang one last time, and Mark's trembling hand reached for it. Before he could answer, the room went dark, and the line went silent. The next morning, the station manager found the studio empty. The neon sign outside buzzed faintly, casting its ghostly glow over an empty parking lot. The only trace of Mark was a faint whisper on the airwaves, repeating the same words over and over. Help me. I'm trapped. The silent carnival arrived without fanfare. One morning, the townsfolk of Millhaven awoke to find it standing at the edge of town, a sprawling maze of striped tents and creaking rides. The air was thick with the scent of spun sugar and something darker, muskier. There had been no flyers, no announcements. Yet, by sundown, the carnival lights blazed, casting eerie, flickering shadows across the fields. Curious, the townspeople gathered, their excitement mingling with unease. What struck them first was the silence. Not a single worker spoke. They moved efficiently, setting up booths and rides, their faces obscured by shadowy hoods or painted masks. The only sounds were the mechanical groans of the attractions and the distant strains of a discordant calliope. Lila Henderson was the first to notice something was off. She'd brought her younger brother, Sam, to the carnival. They started with the carousel, its horses' painted eyes seeming to follow them. The ride spun faster than expected, the music spiraling into a dissonant cacophony. When it finally stopped, Sam's laughter turned to a nervous glance at the operator, a tall man whose mask bore a cracked, frozen grin. He said nothing, simply gesturing toward the next attraction. "Let's go to the games," Lila suggested, trying to shake the creeping unease. At the ring toss, the prizes were odd, a doll with eyes too lifelike, a clock that ticked backwards, a jar of what looked like swirling smoke. Sam won the doll, but when he handed it to Lila, its eyes blinked. She dropped it with a yelp, but the masked attendant silently placed it back in her hands. The deeper they ventured into the carnival, the stranger it became. The mirror maze distorted more than their reflections, their images seemed to move independently, mouths forming words they couldn't hear. In the House of Horrors, the animatronics were too real, their movements jerky and desperate, as if they were trying to escape. People began to vanish. First, it was the McAllister twins, last seen entering the Ferris wheel. Then old Mr. Harper, who'd been eyeing the fortune-teller's tent. Whispers rippled through the crowd, but the carnival workers remained eerily calm, their silence a heavy weight. By midnight, the carnival grounds had thinned, many choosing to leave, though no one could find the entrance gate anymore. Lila clutched Sam's hand tightly as they wandered past the funhouse. She noticed something peculiar, the posters lining the walls were changing. Where there had once been images of acrobats and clowns, now there were faces she recognized. Faces of the missing. She froze as she saw her own face on one of the posters, her eyes wide with terror. Sam's face appeared next, just beside hers. "We have to go," she whispered, her voice trembling. They ran, weaving through the maze of tents and booths, but every path seemed to lead them deeper into the carnival. The air grew colder, the music louder, more discordant. The workers watched them pass, their painted smiles growing wider, their heads turning in perfect unison. Finally, they burst into the big top. It was empty, save for a single spotlight illuminating the center ring. They stopped, catching their breath, when the calliope music ground to a halt. A voice echoed from the shadows, low and menacing. "Welcome to the main attraction." The workers filed in silently, forming a circle around Lila and Sam. Their masks and hoods fell away, revealing faces that were not faces at all. Hollow sockets where eyes should be, mouth stretched impossibly wide. Their bodies shimmered, insubstantial, as if they were made of smoke and shadow. The spotlight dimmed, and the ground beneath them shifted. Lila grabbed Sam, holding him tightly as the floor gave way, plunging them into darkness. When the townsfolk returned the next morning, the carnival was gone. No tents, no rides, no trace it had ever been there. All that remained were the posters, scattered across the field, bearing the faces of the missing. At the bottom of each poster, scrawled in dark, dripping ink, was a single phrase: "The show must go on." The dollhouse arrived on an overcast afternoon, its delicate spires and intricate woodwork casting long shadows across the living room floor. Emily, only 10 years old, stared at the elaborate structure in awe. It had been her grandmother's, passed down through generations, and now it belonged to her. "Take good care of it," her mother said, brushing dust off the miniature furniture inside. "It's been in the family for a long time." Emily nodded, already envisioning the hours she'd spend arranging the tiny chairs and tables, the porcelain dolls with their painted smiles, and the delicate curtains that framed the dollhouse's windows. That night, after her parents had gone to bed, Emily couldn't resist sneaking back to the living room to admire her new treasure. Moonlight spilled through the windows, casting a pale glow over the dollhouse. She reached out to adjust one of the tiny dolls, placing it at the dining table alongside its companions. Satisfied, she went to bed. The next morning, she found the dolls had moved. The dining table was overturned, chairs scattered. One doll lay sprawled on the floor, its painted face cracked. Another was perched on the staircase, its tiny hands gripping the banister as though it were trying to escape. "Emily, did you mess with the dollhouse again?" her mother asked, noticing the disarray. "No, I didn't touch it," Emily said, frowning. She was sure she'd left it perfectly arranged. That night, curiosity got the better of her. She stayed up late, hiding behind the couch with a flashlight, her eyes fixed on the dollhouse. For hours, nothing happened. Just when she was about to give up, she saw movement. One of the dolls, the mother figure in a blue dress, slowly turned its head. Another, a child doll with golden curls, shuffled across the tiny carpet, dragging a miniature knife from the kitchen set. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She watched as the dolls positioned themselves in the living room of the dollhouse, reenacting a scene of chaos. The mother doll lay on the floor, the child doll standing over her, knife raised. Panicked, Emily ran to her room and pulled the covers over her head. She didn't tell her parents, certain they wouldn't believe her. The next morning, the news on TV reported a grisly incident. A woman and her daughter, who lived just down the street, had been found in their home. The mother had been attacked, and the child was missing. Emily's stomach churned. She ran to the dollhouse and found the dolls rearranged once again. This time, they were in the dollhouse's kitchen. The father figure held a miniature frying pan, standing over the crumpled form of another doll. By evening, the news reported another tragedy. A man had been found in his kitchen, his injuries eerily resembling the scene Emily had seen that morning. Desperate, Emily tried to tell her mother about the dollhouse, but her mother brushed it off as an overactive imagination. That night, Emily resolved to stop whatever was happening. She removed the dolls, locking them in a box and hiding it in the attic. But the next morning, the dolls were back in the dollhouse, arranged in a new scene. This time, they stood in a bedroom, the father doll leaning over a smaller doll lying motionless on the bed. Emily's heart sank. She recognized the bedroom. It was hers. Terrified, she begged her mother to get rid of the dollhouse. Her mother, concerned by her daughter's sudden fear, agreed. They took it to the local antique shop and left it there, hoping to be rid of its sinister influence. That night, Emily felt a fleeting sense of relief. But when she woke in the middle of the night, she froze. The dollhouse was back, standing in the corner of her bedroom, its tiny windows glowing faintly in the dark. Inside, the dolls had arranged themselves once again. They were all looking up, their painted eyes fixed directly on Emily. And the child doll with golden curls was missing. Jason had always considered himself a rational man. Logical, pragmatic, not one for superstition. That was why he dismissed it the first time he noticed something odd about his bathroom mirror. It was a fleeting thing, a hesitation in his reflection as he brushed his teeth. He chalked it up to tired eyes or a trick of the light. But the lag didn't go away. Each morning, his reflection seemed to pause just a fraction of a second too long before following his movements. When he waved, his reflection's hand took an extra heartbeat to rise. When he leaned closer to inspect a shaving nick, the face staring back at him moved with unnerving deliberation, as if reluctant to comply. "You're imagining it," he told himself, turning away from the mirror. "It's nothing." Yet, the unease gnawed at him. By the end of the week, he could no longer ignore it. He stood in front of the mirror for hours, testing it. Moving his hand, nodding his head, blinking. And always, the reflection lagged. One night, unable to sleep, Jason decided to test it more deliberately. He grabbed his phone and set up a camera to record himself and the mirror simultaneously. He performed simple motions, raising his arms, turning his head, tapping his cheek. When he reviewed the footage, his blood ran cold. In the recording, his reflection wasn't just lagging. It was moving independently. While Jason had tapped his right cheek, the reflection tapped its left. When Jason smiled, the reflection's mouth curled into a sneer. He smashed the mirror the next morning. For a while, things seemed normal. Jason avoided reflective surfaces, shaving in the shower and turning away from store windows. He tried to convince himself it had all been a bad dream, a hallucination brought on by stress. Then the nightmares began. In his dreams, he stood in an endless hall of mirrors, each one showing a distorted version of himself. Some were taller, others thinner, their faces twisted in grotesque parodies of his own. They whispered to him, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of hisses and jeers. But one reflection, a perfect replica of him, stood silent, watching with cold, unblinking eyes. The dream spilled into waking life. Jason began catching glimpses of movement in reflective surfaces. A flash of motion in a puddle. A shadow in a polished doorknob. Always, it was his reflection, staring back at him with that same cold, calculating expression. The breaking point came one night when Jason's television, turned off and blank, reflected the room. He saw himself sitting on the couch. But while he remained frozen in terror, the reflection stood, walking toward the screen. It placed its hands against the glass, grinning. "Let me out," it mouthed. Jason fled, locking himself in his bedroom. He covered the mirror and every reflective surface he could find, but the sense of being watched never left him. When he finally dared to uncover the mirror days later, he found it empty. His reflection was gone. The absence should have comforted him, but it didn't. He felt exposed, vulnerable, as though something vital had been stripped away. The house seemed darker, the air heavier. One night, as he lay in bed, he heard the sound of glass cracking. He bolted upright, heart pounding. The noise came again, louder this time. He followed it to the bathroom, where the mirror, covered and untouched for days, was splintering. Fissures spread across its surface, the sound sharp and violent in the silent house. And then, with a final shatter, it broke. Jason stared at the empty frame, his breath coming in ragged gasps. From the darkness of the mirror's void, something stepped out. It was him. But not him. The reflection's eyes gleamed with malice, its smile too wide, too sharp. Finally, it said, its voice a distorted echo of his own. "You have no idea how long I've waited." Jason tried to back away, but his feet wouldn't move. The reflection reached out, its hand cold and solid as it gripped his arm. "Your turn," it whispered. Jason screamed as the world around him twisted, pulling him into the mirror's fractured surface. He clawed at the edges, but the reflection, his replacement, only smiled, watching as he disappeared into the void. When he woke, he was standing in the endless hall of mirrors from his dreams. The reflections stared back at him, their whispers filling the air. In the real world, the new Jason looked at himself in the bathroom mirror. He adjusted his tie, the grin never leaving his face. "Perfect," he said, and walked away, leaving the mirror empty behind him. A group of 5 hikers, Maya, Jake, Elle, Sam, and Liam, set out on a weekend adventure into the dense wilderness known as the Blackthorn Forest. Locals spoke of the forest in hushed tones, warning visitors that it was cursed, a place where time and space twisted in unnatural ways. But the group, skeptical and eager for an adventure, dismissed the warnings as superstitions. As they entered the forest, the trees loomed tall and thick, their twisted branches blocking out the sun, casting a shadow that seemed to grow darker with every step. The air was damp and smelled of earth and decay. Despite the oppressive atmosphere, they pressed on, eager to see the beauty the forest promised. Hours passed, and the deeper they ventured, the more unsettling the forest became. The sounds of the world outside faded, replaced by a heavy silence. Even the birds seemed to avoid the place. They stopped at a clearing to rest, setting up camp, but the unsettling feeling in the pit of their stomachs grew stronger. Around the campfire, Maya recalled the stories the locals had shared, how travelers who ventured too deep into the forest had vanished, never to be seen again. At first, the others laughed it off, but the forest had an eerie, unnatural stillness to it, as if it was watching them. That night, as they lay in their tents, the forest seemed to breathe around them, the wind rustling through the trees in a way that didn't feel natural. But the true horror began at dawn. Elle was the first to go missing. When Maya awoke, her tent was empty, the zipper torn open, as if someone, or something, had dragged her out. A search ensued, but they found no trace of Elle, only a chilling message carved into the bark of an ancient tree, "I see you. You can't escape." Terrified, they tried to leave the forest, but the trails seemed to lead them in circles. No matter how far they walked, they always ended up back at the same spot. The forest had become a maze with no exit. Panic set in as the days wore on. Sam, who had been particularly brave, was next. He ventured out alone, convinced he could find a way out, but when he didn't return by nightfall, the remaining group realized something was terribly wrong. In the morning, another message was found, "The forest remembers. You are not welcome." Liam wanted to leave the group and find help, but Jake, now visibly shaken, refused. "The forest has us," he muttered. "We're trapped." One by one, the others disappeared. Maya and Jake, the last 2 survivors, clung to each other, searching frantically for a way out. The messages continued to appear on the trees, each one more cryptic and terrifying than the last. "They are watching. One by one, you will join us." On the 6th day, Jake vanished without a sound, leaving behind only a final, desperate plea carved into the bark of a tree, "Run. It's too late for me." Maya was now alone in the forest, consumed by fear. She stumbled through the thick underbrush, convinced she was being followed. Every tree seemed to shift and distort as if the forest itself were alive, breathing, watching. Eventually, she found herself standing in a clearing. In the center was an old, twisted tree with strange symbols etched into its trunk. As she approached it, a familiar voice called her name. It was Jake, but when she turned, she saw him standing there, his eyes hollow and his skin pale. His mouth moved, but the words were not his own. It's too late for you. You've already joined us. Maya stumbled back, her breath quickening, realizing too late that the forest had claimed them all. The last thing she saw was the trees bark, the symbols twisting and shifting before her eyes, as the forest swallowed her whole. And from that day on, the forest remained, its trees whispering in the wind, warning all who dared enter, the vanishing forest remembers. And you will never leave.